Fantastic Mr. Fox was monumental in that it marked the consummation of one of American cinema's most logical and frankly inevitable author-filmmaker pairings. The marriage between Wes Anderson and Roald Dahl was the kind of matchmaking achievement that just makes the world make sense. That makes you believe that sometimes things are as they should be. That's not to say that one of the most celebrated and popularly adapted children's authors of the 20th century was exactly in dire straits or waiting for someone to do his work justice until 2009. But of the generations of people influenced by Dahl, few directors have been as predisposed to the task as Anderson. Having cited the author as his personal hero, it's hard to imagine that coincidence alone accounts for their shared sense of whimsy, or the sadistic afterbite that accompanies each artist's deceptive childlike cutesiness, or their affinity for minute details and how those details inform their broader characters' emotional arcs. So rather than an equal marriage, this was perhaps more the student becoming the teacher. But as no other filmmaker has taken these qualities and created as rich a body of work in their own right as Anderson has, this union was a milestone for both men, and it was due time we got another round of it. That's also not to say that the Hollywood doll factory had exactly stopped churning out adaptations since Fantastic Mr. Fox, but aside from maybe the BFG, it's been hard for these later works to avoid comparisons to Anderson's film. I think many of the popular Wes Andersonisms that are used as evidence against other filmmakers copying him are recontextualized when we trace a common thread back to Dahl. In the case of Paul King, whose Paddington films rendered him one of the more recently deemed Wes Anderson disciples, his decision to take a crack at Dahl suggests that rather than taking after Anderson, the two may just share a similar affinity for British children's literature. But I think this latest collection of shorts showcases Anderson's artistry beyond just vibrant production design and general quirkiness. I think it's a testament to his constant formal evolution that King's Wonka appears to take a sort of autopilot approach to adapting Dahl, whereas Anderson's latest effort, despite appearing on paper like a bit of an autopilot career move, has turned out to be some of his most surprising, formally inventive, and alienating work yet, more in line with the likes of Percival than any of his own prior films. The 4 shorts from this recent collection, retelling 4 selected short stories from throughout Dahl's career, are each individually the 4 best short films he's ever made, and by such a wide margin that it feels demeaning to talk about them in a context removed from his features. The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar, The Swan, The Rat Catcher, and Poison total to about the length of a feature, and despite being more storybook than ever, they feature some of the bleakest subject matter Anderson's covered to date. Maybe subject matter isn't the right term, because if you describe a group of British kids bullying their neighbor, or a rat catcher demonstrating his macabre methods, or Hitchcockian thriller about a venomous snake, they sound pretty fun. And they are, but gone is the autumnal warmth of Mr. Fox, and in its place is an overcast dryness, and more importantly, a pitch blackness of heart that hasn't infiltrated even the most melancholy of Anderson's prior work. Like every Wes Anderson film, it's easy to take these shorts at face value and say, oh, Wes is pulling from the same old bag of tricks. Convoluted framing devices, stagey blocking, dry, overwrought dialogue. It's not even his first time adapting Dahl. And you wouldn't be wrong. But his ability to evolve these tricks with each subsequent film is one of his biggest strengths. And particularly here, he's vacuum sealed and freeze-dried these tricks into something that doesn't even function as a film per se. This collection operates more in the realm of novels and plays than in the realm of films as we traditionally know them. The tradition when it comes to adapting books has essentially been that really you're adapting the events of the books. The language of the storytelling, the prose and the structure, are building blocks inherently attached to novels as a medium. And naturally it's most filmmakers' inclination to remove those elements, to boil the story down to its basic beats and build up from there in cinematic terms. I mean, if not, then what's even the director's artistic contribution here? Why perform the adaptation in the first place? So beats get switched around, material is cut and invented, characters are combined together, and if there is any particular prose they wish to carry over, it typically survives in the form of dialogue or narration, the latter of which is often rendered redundant to the visual storytelling anyway. This is what Anderson did with Fantastic Mr. Fox, often respecting details of the book, like including some verbatim lines of dialogue, but also inventing about 25 minutes of material, because he and Noah Baumbach were aware of the pacing and scope required for a feature film. Innovative as it is in many other ways, the movie is still largely a traditional novel-to-film adaptation. adaptation. And as far as theater tradition goes, I want to talk about the kind of movie often referred to as a filmed play. Often this is a literal adaptation of a play, and often this is an original film that could just as easily function as a play. And here there's another common set of obligations filmmakers find themselves abiding by to assert the unique capabilities of their medium, which leads so many to prioritize suspension of disbelief or to maintain an unbroken sense of diegesis. What this means is that sets are sold to us as actual locations, everything that would physically exist in the space should be physically present in the frame by way of props or production design, and every character needs a unique face to their name. Unlike theater, where stagehands and double castings and frames and edges disappear from our attention, or even enhance the subject of our focus rather than detract from it, there's conventionally less margin of acceptance in film when it comes to seams and creases, or in other words, artifice. Even Asteroid City, Anderson's prior most radical rejection of these ideas and ode to artifice, is still confined to its face value believability. Despite the plastic sheen over the whole thing, when we're in the world of the play, it's presented as the real world. The only times we physically see the construction of the sets and costumes are when we zoom out to the TV program about the play, where it becomes diegetic to that world. So like Mr. Fox's relationship with its source material, Asteroid City, despite subverting so many other things, still abides by many of these traditional filmic renderings of theatrical settings. I linger on these conventions and how they manifest in Anderson's previous work to illustrate just how monumental it is that Henry Sugar and its colleagues reject all of it, subverting film tradition by embracing traditions of theater and novels within film, by leaning into the seams and showcasing set changes and actors taking on multiple roles, gestures becoming shorthand for actual actions, and props existing merely in suggestion. And perhaps the most extreme formal gambit is that in novelistic fashion, these stories are told almost entirely through the prose they were originally written in, while the performers vaguely act them out. This approach is arguably acinematic. These are essentially elaborate audiobooks. If you're relying on words rather than visuals to communicate story and ideas in a visual medium, why make it a film in the first place? And maybe it doesn't even matter if something is cinematic or not, if it's an emotionally engaging experience. Maybe that's just semantics. But I do think Anderson has managed to use this deconstructive approach to craft a new kind of experience that still relies on unique audiovisual means to evoke emotion, which I would argue is by definition cinematic. Despite not seeing the bullies perform any of these actions, or the train actually approaching in The Swan, the labyrinthine navigation of this maze-like setting and Rupert Friend's code-switching performance delivering every character's dialogue himself as they linger behind him create a uniquely cinematic dread and suspense that the text alone, powerful as it may be, doesn't entirely conjure. The stagey optical illusion of the yogi levitating on the painted apple box in Henry Sugar only starts working once the camera itself pushes in and corrects our perspective. Dahl dictating this passage from the Ratcatcher over Richard Iowati's narration, voices overlapping like an invocation while cutting rapidly between both worlds, becomes viscerally demonic in a way the text itself can only be a blueprint for. So the gambit here isn't that these outlines will disappear and immerse us in the story in spite of its own visible construction. It's that the alienation we face because of it is directly where emotion is drawn from. In fact, I think the pivotal role of narration is just the extra push his latest, more abstract films have needed to transcend the confines of traditional narrative and become truly expressive specifically in their abstraction. Real ones know that the convoluted structure of Asteroid City, for instance, is where the true pathos lies, but it also settles into traditional narrative for long enough in each segment for us to buy in, and then feel like we're being ripped out of it at every act break. And that worked for the purposes of Asteroid City, which I obviously liked a lot, but I find that I actually prefer something like Henry Sugar, that sustains the same distance from the audience for the whole runtime as it goes deeper and deeper into story within story. From Dahl writing about Henry Sugar, reading the doctor's account of what the magician told him he was taught by the yogi, and then gradually yo-yoing back up to Dahl. The whole time we're faced with a barrier between the content of the story and the method of delivery, and then we end on a conclusive beat about this construction, as though Dahl's, and thus Anderson's, staunch commitment to their storytelling devices was the emotional arc we were tracking the whole time, rather than Henry the character's experience. This serves the broader function of turning this series into an exhibit about Dahl as a subject in and of himself, first and foremost above the content of the individual stories. This would be in line with Anderson's Anderson's past few films, eulogizing their own fictitious great men and complicated artists, and what would make more logical and emotional sense as a next step than eulogizing his real-life personal hero? There's even precedent for this in Fantastic Mr. Fox, where Dahl's study was first recreated and where music from the actual audiobook is sampled. And these shorts are far from the first films to ever include the author in their adaptation as a narrator or a framing device, but by also preserving the prose and providing the context in which each story was written as though part of a museum curation, they transcend our natural assumptions about adaptation. Rather than a retelling on his own terms of certain plot beats that Dahl originally came up with, Anderson's showcasing the stories as they were originally told by Dahl, not just honoring the filmmaker, but making him the emotional axis of the series. Of course, the core of each story is still preserved and valued and communicated with appropriate emotional energy, rather than being relegated to a smaller unit of the broader Dahl portrait, but the relationship these films have to their source material is closer to the relationship adaptation has to The Orchid Thief and Susan Orlean than, say, the relationship James and the Giant Peach has to James and the Giant Peach. Anderson the Madman is just able to have it both ways and perform this character study of Dahl by way of retelling each story with invention and mastery of craft. When I mentioned the blackness of heart that's at the core of these stories, I think there's very much a through line here of Dahl's own struggle to write these stories and the importance the very act of writing them has to him. He was not without his fair share of personal tragedy or traumatic experiences, so it's no wonder he has such a cruel sense of humor, or that the darkness behind the heart of Britain's national identity unwittingly comes through in so many of these works. The authority and psychopathy imposed on children in British school systems, the natural consequences of impoverished communities, the splendor and riches of British imperialism. To this last point, one of the darker shared interests between Anderson and Dahl, which is no less a factor in their perfect match, is their grappling with Orientalism, whether they're attempting to critique it or simply falling into the trappings of it themselves. Anderson, of course, has danced between fetishization and attempts to sincerely unpack the trauma of colonized peoples, having set many films and locations with fascist occupation just in the backdrop, which has amounted to some of his most potent character moments. And from what I understand, Dahl spent much of his life sort of dancing between complacence and acceptance of British imperialism and reckoning with his own role in it. And he too set numerous stories in occupied India, informing his characters' traumas and a complicated national identity. Perhaps another thing Anderson got from him, or maybe another thing that serendipitously matched between their sensibilities. I can't really comment with too much authority on this matter, since I haven't actually read all that much Dahl myself, and every time I try to trace this thread further, I find myself just moralizing about Oompa Loompas and feel myself losing the scope of this review. For the record, I do think that despite Dahl's history, these story elements are primarily critical of Britain. But I bring it all up because, to put it lightly, Dahl wasn't exactly a saint, and his relationship with these matters complicates Anderson's relationship with his childhood hero. And that makes this ode, like a child praising his problematic father, much more interesting than if it were just a celebration of a holistically great person. There's no real suggestion of Dahl's more sinister beliefs in any of the films of this series, and it remains largely hagiographical in honor of him. But there are enough moments lingering on the dead stare behind Fiennes' Dahl's eyes to wonder about the inner conflict going on within him, whether he's writing these stories out of guilt or a sheer numbness acquired over the years. And that, I believe, is the source behind some of the truly evil stuff going on at the heart of these stories. Now, if somehow Anderson wasn't privy to all this and is just 100% pro everything about Dahl, then he would not be the only member of this film who's gone to bat for a problematic British author. But hey, that's neither here nor there. So once again, Wes Anderson has made a film, or series of films, in which the story we're experiencing is itself a piece of some larger character arc, burrowing deeper into this meta-land of abstraction, while still telling very approachable, endlessly rewatchable stories. Again, I liked Asteroid City a lot. You can watch my video about it, but I was pretty blown away by these Dahl shorts in a way no other new releases really have this year, at least at the time of me recording this video, which admittedly I haven't seen enough new releases. I'm also pro letting them exist as independent short films rather than an anthology film, for no real reason worth arguing at this juncture. But what a year for Wes Anderson. I know my last video was about his war with AI, but the man really is a machine. That's it from me this time around, but you can always follow me on socials. You can always pledge to my Patreon and get some bonus content, some bonus videos. Links for those are in the description. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.